IBS Spiritual Book Club's live video series, and joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 books which influenced him the most on his life journey is Transformational Teacher and Speaker, founding member of the Transformational Leadership Council, and Human Consciousness Explorer, Chris Attwood. Just a little bit about Chris. He's a leading figure in the transformational world and a master of creating enlightened alliances. He's the co-author of 2 New York Times best-selling books, The Passion Test, The Effortless Path to Discovering Your Destiny, and Your Hidden Riches. And with his business partner and ex-wife, Janet Bray Attwood, he built a global brand with over 4,000 Passion Test facilitators in more than 65 countries. I love that, people helping others discover their passion. So after a successful career in the business world as the CEO or senior executive of more than a dozen companies, Chris took 10 years off for his own inner development, spending 8 to 10 hours a day in meditation and making an extensive study of the Vedic literature of India and the functioning of human consciousness. Chris Attwood, welcome. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Sandie. It's a pleasure and a delight to be back with you. It's been a while.
It has indeed. And it's good considering that you've helped hundreds of thousands around the world discover their destiny, that today we're going to hear a little bit about the books that played a key role in moving you along the path to discovering yours. So tell us, first of all, what do books mean to you?
Well, that's a great question. I think I'd say that books are a way of sharing insights, knowledge, stories. They're throughout history. Stories have been the way that we've taught each generation, from one generation to the next and there's that saying, of course, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. Well, how do we stand on the shoulders of giants? By learning from the people who've come before. So I think books are a way of recording the insights, the knowledge, the understandings that people have had, and so that many other people can benefit from that and use those to expand their own journey.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine a world without books? I certainly can't.
We'd come up with some way of communicating stories, you know.
I'm sure we would.
Think about it. For thousands of years before the printing press was developed, you know, people memorized the stories. The whole Vedic literature actually was passed down from family to family through an oral tradition for several thousand years, and so they couldn't write it, but they repeated it, and that's why they created that literature in verses, you know, so that they were easy to remember. Yeah. There's a cadence, a rhythm to them, and so it was easy to remember them, and they could be sustained in their original form for many generations.
Well, it's a good job that we do have books now, because I think people's attention span these days, they couldn't hold it in their memory.
That's right. We can't remember that long to be able to pass it on.
Yeah. And your first book, very old book, this is only the second time this has come up in, God knows, about 60 different contributions we've had by now. That's the Bible.
Yes. Yeah, well, my father was a Lutheran minister, and so I grew up going to Sunday school every week, and reading the Bible was a part of my upbringing, part of my growth. And you asked, Sandie, I think, as I recall, you asked, what were the books, the spiritual books that had the biggest impact on you? And I couldn't leave out the Bible, because in my early years, that was the only spiritual book I was really exposed to.
Yeah. It's interesting, because one of the things that you said was the interpretation of the Bible, I was taught, seemed to suggest that humans live for as long as they live and then they're judged for all eternity. That made no sense to me, and opened me up to other ways of viewing spiritual life.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Somehow I couldn't get the idea that, you know, you come on this earth for a flicker, a moment of time, you know, even if you happen to live for 80 or 90 or 100 years, it's still, in the context of eternity, it's like just boom, and it's gone. And to think that your entire existence for the rest of eternity is determined by that little brief sojourn on this planet, just it somehow didn't
Yeah.
jive with me.
No, it's just not logical, is it?
No.
So book number 2, this one comes up again and again and again. Autobiography of a Yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda.
Yeah.
What a wonderful book. What a wonderful man.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I was introduced to that book when I was in college, and I think I may have learned Transcendental Meditation by this time, and it might have been in the beginning. I can't quite remember, but I remember reading this book, and it was the first time I had read any book where the author talked about kind of spiritual experiences, out of body experiences, experiences that seemed magical and amazing to me at the time. And it kind of broke some boundaries of thinking in my mind, which I was really grateful for, because it opened me up to a whole new way of looking at life and reality.
Yeah. I mean, so many people said, you know, I couldn't work out if those experiences were true or not. But, you know, the very contemplation that they might be true in itself is pretty mind-blowing.
Well, and he said they were true, and I was
Yeah.
willing to take them. It was his experience. I was willing
Yeah.
to take him at his word. They were true for him at the very least. And that in itself was mind-blowing for me, you know?
Yeah, me too. Me too. And it's interesting, there's a theme to your books. We can see where your interests were taking you. Because the third book is The Science of Being and Art of Living by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
Yeah, that was a great book, because I think I was in the 3rd year of college. I had learned TM a couple of years before, and a good friend of mine was working at Maharishi International University, which at the time was located in a big, huge apartment building. They'd taken over this whole apartment building in Isla Vista, right next to UC Santa Barbara. And Isla Vista was the community where I lived, and of course I was going to UC Santa Barbara at the time. And over the summer months, I didn't have anything to do. And my friend said, well, why don't you come work with me? I'm helping to find sites for academies and things for the TM organization. So I said, okay, fine. Sounded good to me. And I went and did the work, did what I was asked to do. And it turned out right around that time, my friend and his colleague who were working together ended up in Iowa and negotiated on the purchase of a college called Parsons College. It was a liberal arts college that had been it had a reputation for catering to rich party kids, you know, kids that weren't really serious about school but liked to have fun, and their parents wanted them to get a college degree. And Parsons had kind of gone bust around, this was the late 60s, I think. And I think by this time it had been lying dormant for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that. And so the TM organization ended up buying the campus. And I remember my interaction with it was the president of the university, Dr. Keith Wallace, who was one of the early researchers on the physiological effects of TM. Remember, he called a meeting, and the only place in this apartment building where the university was located at the time that everyone could meet together was the dining hall. So we were all called down to the dining hall, and he made the announcement that this university campus has been purchased in Fairfield, Iowa, and in a week we're all going to pack up our things and fly to Iowa. Now, that didn't apply to me, of course, because I was going to UC Santa Barbara, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to be left behind. And while I was working with my friend in this what was called the Academy's office, he had recommended this book, The Science of Being and Art of Living by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. And I remember when I started reading it, it was like, I think I said this in my description, it was like a thirsty man brought to water. You know, it's like I had been in the desert for years, and suddenly this book just provided so much nourishment to me. It's really surprising because I read it now and I think, wow, it's really a great book. It's really fabulous. The knowledge is amazing and wonderful, but it doesn't have the same effect it did then. For some reason, at that moment, it hit me in a way that I couldn't put it down. And so when everyone was leaving now to go back to Iowa, my friend, I said, what am I going to do? I earned these 10 days of course credits, it was called, from the work that I did. And I said, well, what can I do with that? He said, well, why don't you take Maharshi's course called the Science of Creative Intelligence. It's being offered in Northern California. So that's what I did. I applied for that course. It was a 1 month long course. It was an amazing course, really powerful in residence program for a month. And that led me ultimately later to become a TM teacher and so forth. But I remember asking my friend, well, what's the Science of Creative Intelligence? What's that about? And he said, well, it's all the knowledge in that book you've been reading that you love so much. And so that was enough to get me on the course.
It's interesting because the book cropped up a few weeks ago when Robert O. Williams, I think, was on. He actually attended the school. And he met the Beach Boys there because they decided they wanted to promote the Maharishi's work, and they decided to record an album there. So, it's interesting that suddenly this is coming up again and again.
Well, Mike Love of the Beach Boys had, maybe he still has, I don't know, but he had a beautiful estate in between Santa Barbara and the university campus, and they had a recording studio there and all of that stuff. So.
Yeah, that's where Robert also ended up. After he left the school there, he met Mike and ended up working there and had a number of near-death experiences while he was there as well. Yeah. So book number 5, Love and God by Maharishi.
Yeah. So once I had gotten into the kind of, what do you say, the environment of Maharishi's knowledge, and when Maharishi came to the United States, he began teaching TM to people. He began lecturing, and then people wanted to know, well, what do I do to experience this wonderful state of pure consciousness, pure awareness that you're talking about? And so he taught them transcendental meditation, and I remember him saying at the time, I mean, I don't remember, but I remember reading about him saying at the time that that he had to make a decision. Was he going to first teach people the technique to have the experience of pure consciousness, or should he first educate them about what it is and why it's valuable, and then teach them the technique? And he decided that actually it was more important to have the experience than to have the intellectual understanding. And so he began teaching TM. And interestingly enough, I know the TM organization now charges, I don't know, $900 or $1,000 to learn TM, and some people think, oh, that's a lot of money and so on. But I remember Maharishi taught for free the first time he went around the world, and he taught thousands of people to meditate. And then he came back around the second time to the same places, and he found that there were only a handful of people out of, maybe he taught 1,000 people in one location. Maybe there were only 15 or 20 or 40 or 50 who actually still were meditating. And he didn't understand it, and so he asked the people who were there around him at the time, and people said, well, in this society, if people don't pay for something, they don't value it. And so that's when he started charging to learn meditation, to learn TM. And it worked, he continued to teach thousands of people. And the third time he went around the world, something like 75–80% of the people that he taught were still meditating, So it's an interesting little thing. But Love and God came up because as I became interested in Maharishi and his work and his knowledge, these are 2 poems that he wrote in the 60s, in the early days. He first started teaching in 1958, and sometime in the early 60s, he wrote Love and God. And they're just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful poems. At my wedding, we read, a portion of them. They're amazing. I don't know what more to say. I think I include a little excerpt of one of the
You
poems.
did,
And
you did. And if
would
you
you mind
don't,
reading
I've
that?
got
I
it
think
right in
it's
front of me. Yeah. Love is the sweet expression of life. It is the supreme content of life. Love is the force of life, powerful and sublime. The flower of life blooms in love and radiates love all around it. Life expresses itself through love. The stream of life is a wave on the ocean of love, and life is expressed in the waves of love, and the ocean of love flows in the waves of life. What a comfort love brings to the heart. That's a beautiful thing to read at a wedding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's just a tiny portion. I mean, the poem goes on and on and on and on, you know, it's but you get a little taste of it. For me, it was so inspiring, these poems, really inspiring. I think I read them when I was taking the Science of Creative Intelligence course when I went up to Northern California.
So before you studied his books, I mean, were you on one trajectory, and did you find that trajectory changing as you read more of his work?
Well, you know, so I was 17 when I started college, when I went to UC Santa Barbara. The only kind of spiritual discipline that I had known, or spiritual life I had known, was from my father, who was a minister, you know. And so I joined the Lutheran Student Association at UC Santa Barbara, and the first year I was there, I was active and involved in the work that they were doing. Um, but the first year that I was in college, so this is a long time ago, in 1970, it was a time when the Vietnam War was going on. There were student protests all over the country. And William Kunstler, who was the attorney, the lawyer for the Chicago Seven, and there's this great, I don't know if you've seen it, Sandie, but I think Netflix or somewhere, they have this great movie on the Chicago Seven. Really, I loved it.
Yeah.
But William Kunstler came and spoke, and interestingly enough, at UC Santa Barbara, there wasn't enough interest in football to maintain the program, so they had discontinued it. But they had built a football stadium, because, you know, every American college has a football stadium, and the whole stadium was filled. There were over 10,000. There were only 13,000 people at the school, and there were like 10,000 people at this lecture. And he got everyone fired up, just with the what unfairness of what was going on and in Chicago and around the world, and the Vietnam War and all of that. And then so we're all emotional and really thinking, gosh, what can we do here? And we come walking out of the stadium, and there are these big fields. They had these intramural fields where people played football and soccer and so forth. And so we had a view of the roads that came into Isla Vista. There was really only one road that came into Isla Vista. And I remember counting 17 police cars that coming into to this little town. It's a little half square mile area, and 10,000 students basically, primarily living in this area. And it felt like we were being invaded, right? And and so over the next few days, the thing escalated, and some people at one point on the second day, some people took a big battering ram, and there was a Bank of America in the center of the town, surrounded by empty fields and parking lots. So it was all by itself. And the Bank of America was seen as an instrument of American imperialist capitalism, to use that language of the time. And so they broke down the doors to the bank, set the bank on fire. And so this bank is on fire, and the police had gotten some word that there was someone who was trapped inside, which wasn't true. But so they had a busload of police that came in to town, parked on the far side of the field, and then marched across the field in full riot gear with helmets and shields and batons and all their vests and everything. And they line up in front of this crowd of young people, probably 3,000 people there on the street. And it was a very emotional time, as you can imagine. And so the kids are yelling epithets at the police, and the police are some are looking scared, some are looking angry. They're all not much older than the kids in the crowd, right? Most of them, some of them were older. And then the captain somehow felt threatened in some way. And so he told the police to charge the crowd. So they charged the crowd and pushed them back and beat them up, and and then they went back to their line, and meanwhile they're sending someone into the bank to see who was stuck there. They did that 3 times. After the third time, the crowd just got angrier and angrier. They're throwing rocks, they're throwing bottles, you know, they're just really angry. And finally, after the third time, and there's kids now on the ground with their heads bloodied and all of that, the crowd just rushes at the police. And there's only 50 of these guys, you know, the poor guys. Can you imagine 3,000 angry mob coming straight at you? Well, they turned around and ran as fast as they could back to their bus. And the and that, why was I telling you that story? That was kind of, that shifted my perspective on life. You asked, you know, was I on a trajectory? And I was on a trajectory at that point, in the face of that riot. And then there were 2 more riots in Isla Vista that year. And out of that came a community development effort that was aiming to address some of the issues that had come up during the riots, because the demonstrations and the riots were partially aimed at the Vietnam War and what was going on nationally in the US, but they were partially aimed at the local landlords and the kind of tenement conditions that were existing in this student community. It was called a student ghetto. And so on a volunteer basis, the community put together this elected body called the Isla Vista Community Council, and organized, some of the people got together, organized an election. They elected these people. They had no legal authority, you know. It was just, we need some representation to talk to the county and the state and the university and all of that. And so there were 10, 12 people who got elected. One of them was my girlfriend, and at the time. And I applied for and was hired as the planning director for Isla Vista. And so the trajectory that I was on, Sandie, was, how do we change society? How do we save the world? Basically, that was my trajectory, is how do we change the way things are being done so that we live in a more compassionate, more loving society, a society that can work for everyone, because it's clear that the current society doesn't. And so as planning director, my whole aim and goal, and our whole group there at the time, was, let's create examples of different ways of doing things that can then be copied throughout the country and throughout the world in different ways. So it's a very high-minded, visionary sort of goal. But when I was hired as the planning director, there had been one before me, and he had been very high profile, very successful. And now there were a lot of eyes on me. There were a lot of people, not just from the local community, but from the university, from the state, from the county. I was 20 years old. I had more responsibility than I'd ever had in my life. I had a $300,000 budget, which in today's dollars is like $5 million or something. And we had to figure out what to do to redesign this community and make it work. And I was under so much stress. My skin was flaking off my face. I had acid indigestion constantly, nonstop, and I could barely function. And one of my friends had been practicing TM for some time, and he said, "Chris, you should try Transcendental meditation. It's a great way of relieving stress." And I thought, well, I'll try anything at this point, you know. And so I went to the lecture and I heard what they had to say. It sounded okay to me. I paid my $35 at the time, and then I learned. And from the first time I sat down, I noticed that something different was happening. I closed my eyes and I went to a place I had never gone before, you know, just following the instructions that I was given. And that was enough to keep me meditating. In the first week, the flaking went away on my skin, the acid indigestion went away. I started to feel calm. I started being able to make good decisions and be functional and to actually do something good in this job. And so all of those things combined kept me meditating regularly, month after month, because, you know, it was dramatic in the beginning, but after a while, you kind of get used to this new way of being, you know, and it's no longer so dramatic. But I remember a year later, I had to prepare the grant proposal for our funding for the next year. And I went through, and as I was going through and listing all of our achievements and accomplishments of the last year, most of which had been initiated by me with help from others, of course, I got to the third page, and there were some significant things. I mean, we had taken empty lots and turned them into parks. We had gone down to the county board of supervisors and gotten the entire community rezoned so that it couldn't be the population wouldn't be so dense. We had we had done just we had built barrier parks so that cars wouldn't drive across town. They'd go out and around, and bicycles would have priority. We had put in what are called curb bulbs. We put in plantings and landscaping and just tons of stuff. And I looked at this and I went, there's no way I could have done any of this if I wasn't meditating. I mean, when I started meditating, I was practically catatonic from all the stress. And I thought, wow, this is significant. And so that sort of got me on the path of looking more deeply into what Maharishi was teaching, what TM was all about, and then working at MIU and so on and so forth. That was kind of the trajectory I was on, and it sort of continued, but just with a different focus. So I've been talking a lot, but there's one other story I'd love to tell, Sandie, if there's time.
Go ahead.
So after I was planning director, I went back to school, and one of my school projects, my girlfriend and I decided that we would start a food co-op in Isla Vista. And we got 1,000 people to pay $10 each as a deposit, and that was enough money to get all the equipment we needed and to rent a space. And we started this food co-op, and I wrote the vision for the co-op. I remember that, and I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was really about how we wanted to change the way people viewed food and how it got onto their table, and put them more in touch with the process so that they would be respectful and understanding of what it took to be able to create the food that they ate. And the idea was that every member of the co-op would donate an hour a month to help in the store. Not so much to do the work, because we still had staff, but so that they would be more aware of what was going on and what needed to be done in order to sustain the co-op. And that was going really great. I mean, it was very successful. There were lots of people using the co-op. We had a good membership. And then one day, I was sitting in the back of we had this long, skinny store, and there was a little office in the back, and it was nighttime. It was dark. The only light in the whole place was my little light as I was doing the books for the co-op. And I remember going through and discovering that our volunteer cashiers had stolen money from the cash register. Now, that may not seem like a big surprise. I mean, grocery stores all the time, their cashiers probably pocket money here and there. And you go, oh, well, what can we do so that that doesn't happen again? Well, for me, it wasn't like that. This was like, oh my God, these people are the members of the co-op, and yet they're stealing from their own pockets. You know, they're taking money out of their own pockets, which was the whole idea was that when people became more aware, more conscious of these things, that they wouldn't do that kind of thing, right? And so my whole vision of change, how change would happen, that if we changed the way institutions worked, then we could change the society that those institutions were a part of, it all came tumbling down. And it was really at that point, the reason I wanted to tell the story is because that was the point in my life where I realized that it doesn't do any good to change things on the outside if the inside doesn't change. And I know you know this, Sandie, of course. But, and so that really put me on the path of, well, what do I need to do in order to change my inside? And how can I help others change theirs? And so I eventually became a teacher of TM and so on and so forth. But that was the turning point for me, is realizing that changing institutions, changing the way you do things in and of itself doesn't change people's behavior if their internal system, their internal system of beliefs and so forth doesn't change.
Yeah. You went on to become CEO of several companies. I mean, did you take all of those philosophies into those companies with you? And,
yeah, absolutely. Well, and one right around that time, I wasn't CEO of a company, but as a result of the work I'd done as planning director, the member of the board of supervisors from our area appointed me to the 5-member board of directors of the Santa Barbara Metropolitan Transit District. This is the organization that ran all the buses for the whole county of Santa Barbara, right? And I remember I was 22 or 23 years old at the time, and I remember walking in barefooted with my long hair, and I was the youngest one. The next youngest person on that board was 55 years old, and they all kind of looked at me and went, and then they wouldn't talk to me. They looked away, you know. So the next week I said, well, this isn't worth it. I didn't cut my hair, but I did put on a sport coat and a nice shirt and tie, and I went in with shoes on this time. And they went, oh, wow, you look so great, Chris. And now I was part of the club. Even though I was still so young, I was part of the club. And as a result of that, then we were the second county in California to put trailers on the back of buses so that the people could put their bikes on the trailer and ride from the university down to Santa Barbara. I ran a whole campaign that got the students were able to pay a few dollars each quarter and be able to ride the buses without any additional charge. And I became a hero there. And that wasn't so much about applying the philosophy as it was the results of my practice of meditation, you know, that there was a clarity that came and an ability to see and do things that just wasn't there before, you know, and people see these things, they think, oh, well, he was talented, but I wasn't talented, you know. I meditated, my consciousness began to expand, and then my abilities expanded with that. In terms of, you know, later things, I became president some years later, many years later. I became president of a company called Newcomb Government Securities, which was a government securities dealer, needless to say. And that, in that case, you know, basically that whole company was TM meditators, and that was an interesting experience in and of itself. So, and in various ways, shapes, and forms, I haven't tried to intermingle these two things, but meditation and spirituality has always been a deep part of my life. And so as Janet and I then wrote the passion test and began teaching people how to discover your passions, that's directly related to consciousness and to your ability to be open to new possibilities. And so it's been natural for us to share not only the passion test, but also TM and how to be able to connect with your passions in the most effective way.
Wouldn't it be great if you think about all these, you know, kids leaving school, not knowing what they want to do, if the passion test was offered to them?
Required reading, required
Yeah.
practice, for sure.
Yeah, rather than having them go through years and years of trying different things before they know what it is they want. And some of them never really get to know what it is.
Unfortunately, that's true. You know, most of the clients of the passion test tend to be in their 40s, 50s, or 60s. You know.
Yeah,
it's
so
because
they've been through the mill and found it didn't work.
They spent 15, 20 years doing what they were told would make them happy, and they didn't end up happy. And so now they say there's got to be a better way, a different way. And so then they find us somehow.
Yeah. And TM is another thing that should be taught in schools. But of course, in some places in the US, it's actually banned. I mean, meditation.
Well, but in some places in the US, it is being taught now. The David Lynch Foundation, you know, the famous movie director, David Lynch, has the David Lynch Foundation has provided funding so that some of the most challenged schools in San Francisco, Chicago, and I think they've started in New York now, schools where they had to have metal detectors for the kids to go into school because there was so much violence and so forth. I remember hearing one story in San Francisco that the school that had the highest suspension and it's not eviction. What is it when kids are kicked out of school?
Expulsion.
Expulsion rate, yeah. The highest expulsion rate of the whole San Francisco school district. They decided they were desperate. We'll try anything, you know. And so they didn't implement TM per se. What they did is they implemented something called quiet time. So they have 20 minutes or 30 minutes of quiet time in the morning and before the kids go home at night. And those who want to learn TM are offered TM without charge. And so most of the students and I think all or most of the faculty learned the TM practice. And 3 years later, 4 years later, something like that, it had gone from the highest expulsion rate in the district to the lowest expulsion rate. Stuff like that. I love stories like that. I have to
Yeah,
say.
yeah. I spoke to one of the, I don't know, governors, Democratic. I don't know if he's a senator, what he is, but Tim Ryan in
Oh
Ohio,
yeah.
and
Oh,
he
yeah.
had championed that in schools, and they were finding that a lot of the kids, especially those with ADHD and learning difficulties, who reacted by not wanting to be at school, and they
Right.
found that those rates of absenteeism changed dramatically.
Yeah. No, it's been great. I mean, what the work that the David Lynch Foundation is doing is fantastic, because people who would never otherwise have access to meditation are learning, and including veterans with PTSD coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth, and women in Africa who have been, through these kind of genocidal experiences. You can imagine the PTSD of these families in these places. And I'm just so grateful that people in those situations have the opportunity to have a technique like TM, which is so life transforming.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Change it from within and everything changes without.
That's right.
So let's move on. Book number 6 by an unknown author, Deepak Chopra, Quantum Healing, Exploring the Frontiers of Mind-Body Medicine. He's got to be one of the most prolific authors that there is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so tell us how that book impacted you.
Yeah, so there was a period in my life after I was president of the Government Securities Company. I left and spent 10 years in long meditation. I was on this special program that Maharishi had created, and there was a program for men, a program for women, and during that time, I was living in upstate New York at an academy that we had there, and Deepak at this point was actively involved with Maharishi and the TM organization, and he had written Quantum Healing after discussions with Maharishi and with the Ayurvedic, the Vaidya's from India that Maharishi brought together, because Maharishi went and he, in each of the Vedic disciplines, Ayurveda and Sapatya Ved, Gandharva Ved, Jyotish, these different Vedic disciplines, he brought the representatives of the families throughout India who had been charged with maintaining those traditions. He brought them together and then systematically went through to piece them together to find where were the gaps, the places, the things that were missing, and so forth. And so Deepak was part of that process in the early days. And Quantum Healing was such a practical book because, I mean, it's a little bit of philosophy, but it's mostly about the practice of Ayurveda and how to identify your prakriti, that means your body type, and what kind of diet to eat, what's good for your particular body type and what's not. So it was so practical, and I just loved it. Excuse me, I remember going through the whole book and figuring out my body type and figuring out what sort of diet would be good for me and all of those things. It was my first real introduction to Ayurveda.
And to Deepak?
And to Deepak. I mean, because Deepak was working with Maharishi closely at that time, we saw a lot of videos of Deepak, and a few times I met him in person. Later, I actually worked personally with Deepak. Maharishi asked me and another colleague to go and meet with the wealthiest people in the United States and tell them that 7,000 yogic flyers can create world peace. And that's a whole story in of itself. There's a whole body of research that's been done showing that groups of people practicing TM and their advanced techniques can actually reduce crime, reduce war deaths, reduce accident rates, increase economic prosperity, all sorts of things like that. And so during that project, Deepak at the time was managing the Maharishi Ayurveda Center in Lancaster, Massachusetts. And so when we would meet with someone and they were receptive, then we would introduce them to Deepak and suggest that they come to Lancaster to go through the Ayurvedic process called Panchakarma. And so they would meet Deepak and they would they would have some experience and so on. So we were finished at that point. So, but yeah, I love Deepak. You know, I think Deepak he was and is a brilliant man who I just wish that his path and Maharshi's had stayed a little bit more aligned. But that's my, my thing.
So book number 7, we're going to have some fun pronouncing this one. Lalo Yoga Vasishta.
The Lalo Yoga Vasishta. Oh gosh, I love this book. I will tell you, this book is not for everybody. It's sort of not like your light reading that you're gonna sit down on a Sunday night, and make it through. But it's a beautiful book. It's an amazing book. Yoga Vasishta is, I think, actually 12 volumes, something like that. Lalo Yoga Vasishta is 1 volume summarizing the teachings of the ancient sage Vasishta, teaching Rama, who was, if you know anything about Indian lore, the Ramayana is the story of Lord Rama and Sita, his wife, and how Sita was stolen away by Ravana, the demon Ravana, and all the adventures Rama and then Hanuman went through to recover Sita and to destroy this negative influence in the world. And so when Ram was a young boy, he was taught by this sage, this seer by the name of Vasishta. And so Lalo Yoga Vasishta is the teachings of Vasishta to Ram. And it's a series of stories, it's a series of fascinating stories. And at the time I read the book, initially I was in New York, actually, in upstate New York. I mentioned this academy, and I read it a couple of times. And then I got moved up to Huntsville in Canada. This is up in the middle of the forest on a lake. It was gorgeous. The TM organization had an academy there as well. And I remember it was a hot, sunny day, okay, in summertime. And all my friends were out by the lake, and there was a little sandy beach, and they were lying out and enjoying themselves. And where was Chris? Chris was in his room in a bathtub filled with cold water, sitting in the bathtub reading Lalo Yoga Vasishta, because I read it 3 times. That I couldn't put it down. It was same kind of experience that I had when I was reading The Science of Being and Art of Living. It hit me right at that perfect time when I needed that knowledge, when I needed that thing. And the biggest thing that I remember about it is that it broke boundaries in my mind of how the world works. Same sort of thing as the Autobiography of a Yogi, except in a different way. It was really profound teachings, speaking on many different levels at the same time. And it just broke things loose inside somehow. It says at the beginning, the introduction to Yoga Vasishta, actually, it says that this book is not for those who are already enlightened, nor is it for those who have not yet begun pursuing a spiritual path. It's for those who have come along the spiritual journey and who are ready to take that next leap to realization. So somehow it hit me right at that. Not that I was at the point of realization necessarily, but it hit me at the right time. It was such a beautiful, wonderful book of stories that had a profound impact.
Well, on the theme of breaking loose and breaking boundaries, the next book, which is quite different, Busting Loose from the Money Game, Mind-Blowing Strategies for Changing the Rules of a Game You Can't Win, by your friend Robert Scheinfeld.
That's right. And
that's cropped up a few times too.
Has it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Robert is a dear friend. I think, as I mentioned in my description, I've known him for quite a few years now. And when he wrote this book, he sent a copy to me and said, I thought you might like to read it. And so I read it. And, here I am. I've been meditating for 20, 30 years by this time. I had read a lot of spiritual literature. But what I loved about this book is that Robert spoke about reality in terms that no one else I had ever heard of had used. He described things that resonated with my own experience, but used a language that was completely novel and unusual. And as a result of that, like other books, it just allowed a sort of a deeper understanding or a deeper appreciation of my experience, and shifting certain concepts inside in ways that were really wonderful and dramatic. Now, if you ask Robert now, he'll say, well, Busting Loose from the Money Game was a good introduction, but what I teach now is completely different than that, and it is. But he's sort of taken it to another level, which is great. But Busting Loose from the Money Game, it just hit me at the right time, primarily because of he invented new language for all sorts of things, which was really cool. And it made sense.
Number 9, all love flows to the self. Eternal stories from the Upanishads. Tom Egnis.
Tom Egnis.
Egnis. So many different ways to pronounce that name I came across. So Egnis.
Right.
Okay.
Tom Egnis. So this book, what Tom and his co-authors have done, Tom is a Sanskrit scholar, and they went through the Upanishads and pulled out the story portions. You know, the Upanishads have both teaching portions and story portions. So they pulled out all the story portions from the Upanishads and put them together in this book. And so when I have been homeschooling my kids, we're on the Bhagavad Gita now, so it's been a few years since we've done the Upanishads, but I pulled out this book and used it as a basis for homeschooling my kids, to introduce them to some of the concepts of consciousness, but in a story format, you know, in a way that would be fun and interesting for them to read it. And really, that's why I put this book on the list, is because it's a great way to have an introduction to the Upanishads, light, easy reading, fun, but it still has very profound concepts that the Upanishads, of course, have been quoted and referred to by some of the greatest thinkers of all time, because they have such profound wisdom within them.
Number 10, the title itself, I mean, you know, this is about coming home. This is the perfect way to end your list, a mind at home with itself. It's what we all aspire to.
That's right.
How asking 4 questions can free your mind, open your heart, and turn your world around. Of course, it's by Katie.
That's right. Well, I had the good fortune around the year 2000 to be able to work with Katie, to support her work, and to live with her, actually. She had 3 or 4 of us who lived in the house that she owned in Manhattan Beach. And so I was very close to Katie. And again, it was one of those things. You know, you go through your life. I don't know if this is your experience, Sandie, but it's been my experience for sure. Is that I've gone through my life and I'm just going along, living my life. And then like the perfect thing comes for somewhere out of the blue, who knows? And Byron Katie, Janet, my ex-wife and business partner and co-author of The Passion Test, was asked by Byron Katie to be her marketing director. And Janet called me up. I was at the time, I had gone back for another year of long meditation after being away for 10 years. And she called me up and said, you know, this woman, Byron Katie, has asked me to be her marketing director. I need you to meet her and tell me if I should do this or not. She didn't really mean that, but what she meant is I want to get your feedback, your input, you know. And so Janet flew me to, where was it, Washington, D.C., where Katie was doing a workshop. And I remember sitting with her. And it was just profound, you know, the simple process she calls the work, 4 questions and a turnaround. You know, is it true? Can you absolutely know that it's true? How do you react, or how do you feel when you have that thought? Who would you be without that thought? And then what she calls the turnaround. So, I mean, it's powerful stuff. And so when I went back, it was time for me to leave this meditation period. And I called Katie because Janet and I had talked with her a lot in both Washington, D.C. and Boston. So she knew me by now. And I called Katie and said, Katie, I'd like to come and help you if you're open to it. And would there be any place for me to live? And she said, yes, honey, please come. And you can stay in the pit. Okay, I'm not sure if that sounds exactly welcoming, but so it turned out that Katie had this house in Manhattan Beach, California, and on the ground floor was an office. On the second floor were 3 bedrooms, which Katie was in one, and there were 2 young women who were helping her, who were on that same floor. And then on the top floor was the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen. So you had this gorgeous view of the ocean, right, up over the roofs of the other houses. And the living room was like this, and then there was a step down, and then there was a fireplace over here. And they called that the pit because it went down a step. And so for a year, every day I would undo my piece of foam, put it on the floor, roll out my bedroll, and sleep there. And then in the morning, I'd roll it all up and put it in the closet, right? And that was my life. But it was really a special time, because as profound as meditation has been and is in my life, if there was only one thing I could keep, of all the things I'd learned, I'd keep my meditation practice. But the number 2 thing is Katie's work. And that's because there were still beliefs and concepts that sometimes made me feel uncomfortable or suffer even. And by doing the work, I found that it was possible to unravel those concepts. And then it started, as Katie says, living inside of me, that a thought would come and I would say, is that true? Can I really know that that's true? I remember at the time I was first introduced to Katie, I went back to North Carolina, where this large meditation group was. And I came out of the meditation hall and I thought, I think I'll go to lunch. And then I remember immediately came up, is that true? Can I really know that there's an I? Can I absolutely know that there's an I? And how do I react when I have a thought that there's an I? Well, I think that there's me, that I'm in this body, that I have to eat, these sort of things. And who would I be without that thought? Well, I would just be here, present, walking to the dining hall or not, or whatever. And then it all happened kind of spontaneously, Sandie. It unraveled on the whole sentence. I think, can I really know that it's me that's thinking, and blah blah blah, and like, it was so much fun. So this book is on another level, though. This is not an introductory book. The introductory book that Katie wrote is called Loving What Is. And for anyone who's not familiar with Katie's work, I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's extremely powerful. But for people who've been on a spiritual path for some time, this book takes the Diamond Sutra of the Buddha and analyzes its meaning from Katie's perspective. And it's really about the non-existence of existence, and how it can be possible that there can be a self and yet there's no self at the same time. I mean, it's way out there for anyone who's not familiar with these kind of concepts. But if you have been, as I have been and was, this one was just released a few years ago, and I remember reading it and go, whoa, this is amazing, because it resonated so much with my own internal experience by this time. It's just that being one of the things that I have learned, Sandie, about spiritual growth is that the measure of evolution, at least in my life and world, has been my ability to live, to accept, not only accept, but to welcome uncertainty, to be able to live in a place of not knowing and being okay with that, And so, Katie, there's a lot of that in that particular book. So I'm going to have to go in a minute, but I'd love to.
I know you are. And you've got one more book you want to share with everybody.
I would like to share that book, because this one just came out on April 1st. And I think it's amazing. And anybody who's listening to this interview, I hope that you'll get it. Right now, it's only available in English as an ebook. If you speak Spanish, it's available in Spanish as a print book, but only as an ebook. It's available on Amazon, Kindle, Nook, all those places. It's called One Unbounded Ocean of Consciousness. It's written by Dr. Tony Nader. Dr. Tony Nader is a medical doctor who was trained at Harvard Medical School, who has a PhD in neuroscience from MIT, and who was chosen in 2008 by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi to be Maharishi's successor when Maharishi passed away that year, in leading the TM organizations worldwide. So, TM operates in more than 150 countries. There's more than 10 million people who have learned to meditate. There are some 40,000 teachers. There's universities in the US and Europe and elsewhere. Dr. Nader oversees all of that. And what's amazing about this book is here you have a man who, in my experience, has both a big, beautiful heart, but he has also this huge intellect. And as I mentioned to you, Sandie, when his book was coming out, he asked Janet and I if we would advise him, consult with him, help him, support him with the release of his book, because he said, I know a lot about consciousness, but I don't know much about book launches, you know, how you get a book out. And this book is the premise, the fundamental premise of the book is that consciousness is all there is. There is nothing but consciousness. And what Dr. Nader does in a very systematic and clear way is, both from a scientific perspective and from a logical perspective, explains why we have to conclude, if we go through and think logically about the structure of life and creation, we have to conclude that consciousness is primary and matter is secondary, that matter emerges from consciousness, not the other way around. And of course, this is a big debate that's gone on in psychology and in scientific circles for many, many years. But I think he gives the clearest case ever made, in my opinion, for why it has to be the case that consciousness is the prime mover of life. And then he describes how consciousness, how matter emerges from consciousness and why that happens. And so the book is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's definitely not written for a third grader, you know, but it is, but it's very understandable at the same time. You know, I mean, you don't have to be a genius to read and understand this book. You have to be open and willing to go through and think about the concepts. I think for me, it's the kind of book I'll read 2, 3, 4 times, because his logic is so beautiful, and the step-by-step way in which he describes how consciousness comes to become aware of itself, and then being aware of itself, it then begins to, it creates a 3-in-1 structure within its unified awareness of being consciousness. It's conscious, it becomes conscious of itself. Then by being conscious, there has to be an observer, something that is observed, and a process of observation. So by becoming conscious of itself, consciousness creates this 3. And then he describes how those 3 each have their own perspectives and how they then emerge into the world and creation that we see. And it's for someone who's interested in this stuff, it's fascinating. It's absolutely has to be a must-read book on anyone's list if you like this kind of stuff.
This is the book that we give to all our relatives who say you're crazy for believing all that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
wow, Chris, thank you so much. I know you have to go. Very quickly before you go, what are you reading now if it's not this book?
what am I reading now? Well, I am reading this book right now,
Okay.
so that's the predominant
enough.
thing. And without going too much into it, I kind of always have, I don't know if always is true, but I have 2 tracks going on right now. I have one track, which is kind of spiritual knowledge literature of one sort or another. And the other track is just pure fun. So I have my fantasy fiction books that I read that are just pure stories, pure entertainment. I love them. And
famous fantasy author?
No,
Favorite?
no famous. Favorite?
Favorite?
Well, I mean, this is not going to sound very original at all.
Doesn't need to.
But I read all the Harry Potter books. My excuse was that I wanted to use them to help my kids enjoy reading better. So I had to read them, of course. And I love them, and my kids love them. And J.K. Rowling is just a brilliant author, and I think anyone who loves magic and miracles and fantasy things, it's a great series, fantastic series.
Chris Attwood, I'm going to let you go now, and I will do the outro without you because I know you've got another appointment. Thank you for being so generous with your time and giving us your 11 best spiritual books.
That's right. Sandie, thank you so much. And as I told you before we started, I'm so grateful to you for creating this series because I think it's such fun to talk with people about the books that have impacted their lives and how they've impacted their lives. It's just brilliant. And I hope that many more people get to participate and appreciate and learn from your guests and the things that have helped them on their journey. So thank you so much, Sandie.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Chris. Bye-bye. Give my love
Bye.
to Janet.
I will.
Okay, bye-bye. And that's it for today. Thank you to everybody at home for joining us. If you want to be the first to be notified of these events or watch the videos, you can join the No BS Spiritual Book Club private Facebook group, or you can visit the video page at the nobsspiritualbook.com, where you can also download MP3 recordings if you like to listen to these in your car while driving, on your phone or your whatever device you've got. That's it. I'll look forward to seeing you at the same time next week. Till then, it's goodbye from me.